The black town car pulled up to the elegant brownstone on East 73rd Street, just as the sun was setting over Manhattan. Kenji Nakamura stepped out onto the sidewalk, adjusting his navy suit jacket and taking a deep breath of the crisp October air. The building before him looked like something from a movie, all warm brick and glowing windows with a doorman who nodded respectfully as he approached. This wasn't just any dinner party. Tonight, he would be dining with some of the most powerful people in American business. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, printed on thick cream paper with elegant gold lettering. An intimate gathering of global leaders, it had said. Kenji had stared at those words for a long time, knowing that attending could open doors for his company that had been locked for years. He owned one of Japan's fastest-growing technology companies, specializing in artificial intelligence that could predict market trends with scary accuracy. Back home, everyone knew his name. Magazine covers, television interviews, speaking engagements at universities. He was used to being recognized, respected, understood. But here in New York, he felt like a stranger trying to break into a club where he didn't know the secret handshake. Thea. Dorman led him through a marble lobby and up to the 3rd floor. As the elevator doors opened, Kenji could hear the sound of laughter and conversation flowing from an open doorway down the hall. He paused for just a moment, straightening his shoulders. His English was good enough for business meetings, but these social gatherings were different. People talked faster, used slang he didn't always catch, made references to things he'd never heard of. His translator, Hiroshi, was supposed to be here tonight. They had worked together for 5 years, and Hiroshi understood not just the language but all the little cultural things that could trip up a conversation. But yesterday morning, Hiroshi had called from a hospital bed with food poisoning, his voice weak and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Nakamura. I tried to find a replacement, but..." Kenji had told him not to worry, that he would manage fine on his own. Now, standing outside the apartment door, he wasn't so sure. The hostess greeted him with a bright smile and a firm handshake. Patricia Wellington was old money, the kind of woman who seemed born knowing exactly what fork to use and which wine paired with which conversation topic. Her penthouse apartment was decorated with museum-quality art and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Kenji, we're so thrilled you could join us tonight," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy Americans used when they wanted to sound both welcoming and impressive at the same time. "Everyone is simply dying to meet you. Your company's latest innovation has been the talk of Silicon Valley." She led him into a living room where about 20 people stood in small groups, wine glasses in hand, engaged in animated conversation. The room itself was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, soft lighting that made everyone look like they were posing for a magazine photo. Servers moving quietly between guests with silver trays. "Let me introduce you to some folks," Patricia said, placing her hand lightly on his arm and steering him toward the nearest group. "This is Robert Thornfield. He runs the largest investment firm on the East Coast. And this is Catherine Mills. You might know her company. They're revolutionizing sustainable energy." The introductions began, and Kenji found himself shaking hands and exchanging business cards with people whose names he recognized from financial newspapers. They all seemed genuinely interested in meeting him, asking questions about his company's growth, his plans for expansion into American markets, his thoughts on the future of artificial intelligence. But as the conversations continued, Kenji began to feel that familiar sense of disconnection creeping in. It wasn't just the language, though, that was part of it. When Robert mentioned getting our ducks in a row for Q4, Kenji had to think for a moment about what ducks had to do with business quarters. When Catherine laughed about throwing someone under the bus, he pictured an actual bus and wondered, what was so funny? It was deeper than idioms, though. These people spoke in a kind of code that went beyond words. They referenced shared experiences, prep schools, country clubs, vacation spots in the Hamptons, that created an instant understanding between them. They made jokes about politicians and celebrities, quoted movies and TV shows, discussed restaurants and art galleries like old friends catching up. Kenji smiled and nodded, asking follow-up questions when he could, but he felt like he was watching A play where everyone else knew their lines perfectly and he was struggling to keep up. Back home, business dinners were different. There was more silence, more careful consideration of words. Respect was shown through what you didn't say as much as what you did. Here, the loudest voice often seemed to win the most attention. During a conversation about market volatility, Kenji tried to share an insight about Asian trading patterns that might be relevant. But just as he began to speak, two other people started talking at the same time, and somehow his voice got lost in the mix. By the time there was another opening in the conversation, the topic had moved on to something else entirely. He excused himself and stepped out onto a small balcony overlooking the park. The city stretched out below him, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere down there were probably thousands of other people who felt exactly like he did right now. Smart, successful, but somehow out of place in a world that seemed designed for someone else. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter back in Tokyo. "How's the fancy dinner, Dad? Are you impressing all the Americans with your charm?" He smiled, typing back a simple, "All good," even though that wasn't quite true. When he returned to the party, dinner was being announced. The dining room was set with crystal and china that looked like it belonged in a palace. Place cards directed everyone to their seats, and Kenji found himself between a tech entrepreneur who kept checking his phone and a woman who ran a chain of luxury hotels and seemed to know everyone in the room personally. As the first course was served, Kenji looked around the table at all these confident, successful people and wondered if this was what it would always feel like. Would expanding his business into America always mean sitting at tables where he felt like an outsider looking in? Was this the price of global success? He picked up his fork and took a bite of what appeared to be some kind of seafood preparation he didn't recognize. The conversation flowed around him like a river he couldn't quite step into, and he prepared himself for a long evening of polite smiles and careful navigation through a social world that seemed to have rules he was still learning. The conversation at dinner started innocently enough. Someone mentioned the latest political developments, and suddenly everyone had an opinion. Kenji listened carefully, trying to follow along as voices rose and fell around the elegant table. The words themselves weren't the problem. He understood most of what was being said. It was everything else that left him feeling like he was watching a tennis match where he couldn't quite follow the ball. "Well, you know what they say about politicians and diapers," said the man to his left, a tech entrepreneur named David who had made billions selling his social media company. The entire table erupted in laughter, and Kenji found himself smiling politely while having no idea what diapers had to do with anything. The woman across from him, Victoria, who owned a string of high-end hotels, jumped in with another joke that seemed to build on the first one. More laughter. Kenji nodded and tried to look engaged, but inside he felt like someone had handed him a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "Speaking of changes," said Robert, the investment firm owner, turning toward Kenji with what seemed like genuine interest. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on how AI regulation might evolve in Asia. Your perspective could really help us understand what's coming down the pipeline." Finally, a question Kenji could sink his teeth into. He took a moment to organize his thoughts, considering how to explain the complex regulatory landscape in Japan and how it differed from American approaches. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, Victoria started telling a story about a recent trip to Singapore that somehow connected to Robert's question. "Oh, you absolutely must hear this," she said, her voice cutting across his intended response. "So there I was in this meeting with government officials, and they're explaining their new tech policies. But the whole time I'm thinking about that hilarious article in the Times about robot restaurants. Did anyone else read that piece?" The conversation spiraled off into discussions about robot restaurants, which led to someone mentioning a documentary they'd seen, which somehow connected to a story about a funny experience at a Japanese restaurant in Los Angeles. Kenji watched his opportunity to contribute slip away like water through his fingers. This kept happening throughout the evening. He would identify a moment where his expertise could add real value to the discussion, but by the time he had formulated his thoughts in English and found an appropriate pause in the rapid-fire conversation, The topic had moved on to something completely different. When they discussed market trends in Asia, Kenji had decades of experience and insights that could have been valuable. But as he prepared to share his perspective and the unique challenges of the Japanese market, the conversation veered toward someone's vacation in Thailand and their amusing attempts to navigate street food vendors. During a discussion about innovation in technology, Kenji tried to explain how his company's approach differed from Western models, how they prioritized long-term relationship building over quick profits. But his careful, thoughtful way of speaking seemed to get lost among the quick wit and rapid exchanges that dominated the table. "The thing about business in Asia," said Patricia, the hostess, as if she were an expert despite having visited exactly 3 times for shopping trips, "is that everything takes so much longer because of all the ceremony and tradition. It's fascinating, really, but so different from how we do things here." Kenji wanted to respond, to explain that what she saw as unnecessary ceremony was actually a sophisticated system for building trust and ensuring long-term partnerships. But Catherine had already launched into a story about her own business dealings in Hong Kong, and the moment passed. The most frustrating part wasn't that people were being rude or dismissive. Everyone was actually quite friendly and seemed genuinely interested in having him there. The problem was the pace and style of conversation. These were people accustomed to thinking out loud, to interrupting and being interrupted, to building ideas collaboratively through rapid back-and-forth exchanges. Kenji came from a business culture where silence was valued, where you thought carefully before speaking, where interrupting someone was considered deeply disrespectful. Here, silence seemed to be viewed as disengagement, and careful consideration of words was seen as hesitation or lack of confidence. He watched as deals were discussed, and partnerships were hinted at through casual conversation. David mentioned needing help with international expansion, and within minutes 3 people had offered connections and advice. Victoria talked about looking for new investment opportunities, and suddenly everyone was pitching ideas or making introductions. These weren't formal business negotiations. They were organic relationship-building exercises disguised as dinner party conversation, and Kenji was struggling to participate in a game where he didn't fully understand the rules. "You know what's interesting," said Robert, cutting into his thoughts. "We keep talking about global markets, but I bet Kenji has insights about consumer behavior in Asia that could revolutionize how we think about product development. What do you think, Kenji? How do Japanese consumers make purchasing decisions differently than Americans?" Another opening, another chance to contribute something meaningful. Kenji set down his fork and prepared to share his thoughts about the cultural factors that influenced buying patterns in Japan. But before he could speak, David's phone rang. "Sorry, I have to take this," David said, standing up from the table. "It's my team in California, and we're launching something tomorrow morning." As David stepped away to take his call, the conversation naturally shifted to discussing product launches and timing across different markets. By the time David returned 5 minutes later, they were deep into a discussion about social media marketing strategies, and Kenji's opportunity had evaporated once again. He began to understand why his translator Hiroshi had been so valuable in these situations. It wasn't just about converting words from one language to another. Hiroshi understood the rhythm of American conversation, knew when to jump in, how to create space for Kenji's more thoughtful communication style. Without that cultural bridge, Kenji felt like he was trying to merge onto a highway where all the cars were going much faster than he was comfortable driving. As the evening wore on, he found himself participating less and observing more. He watched how these successful people built relationships through shared references and quick wit. He noticed how they used humor to diffuse tension, how they tested ideas by throwing them out casually and seeing how others responded. It was actually quite impressive, this style of communication. These people could process information quickly, build on each other's ideas in real time, and establish rapport through rapid exchanges of thoughts and experiences. But it was also exhausting for someone who wasn't used to it. By the time the main course arrived, Kenji had resigned himself to being more of an observer than a participant. He smiled and nodded, asked occasional questions, and tried to project engagement while feeling increasingly isolated from the dynamic conversations happening around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, surrounded by some of the most influential people in American business, exactly the kind of connections he needed to grow his company internationally. But instead of building relationships and exploring opportunities, he felt like he was stuck behind a glass wall, able to see everything but unable to truly participate. He thought about his company back in Tokyo, about his employees who trusted him to navigate these international waters successfully. They were counting on him to open doors in the American market, to forge the partnerships that would take their innovative technology global. But sitting at this elegant table, listening to conversations he couldn't quite join, Kenji wondered if he was the right person for this challenge after all. The main course had been cleared away, and servers were quietly refilling wine glasses around the table. Kenji found himself studying the intricate pattern on his dinner plate, half listening to a conversation about real estate investments that he couldn't meaningfully contribute to. The isolation he felt was becoming almost physical, like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was considering how to politely excuse himself for a few minutes when a gentle voice spoke near his left ear. The words were in Japanese, spoken with perfect pronunciation and formal respect. "Excuse me, sir. Would you care for more wine this evening?" Kenji turned, startled not just by hearing his native language, but by how naturally and correctly it was spoken. Standing beside his chair was a young woman wearing the same black uniform as the other servers. She was holding a bottle of red wine, her posture respectful but confident. What struck him immediately wasn't just that she was speaking Japanese, but that she was using the proper level of formality, the kind of careful politeness that showed real understanding of the language's cultural nuances. "Yes, please," he replied in Japanese, unable to hide his surprise. "Your Japanese is excellent. Where did you learn to speak so well?" The young woman smiled as she carefully poured the wine. "I studied international business at Waseda University in Tokyo for 4 years, she said, still speaking in perfect Japanese. "I also worked for a consulting firm in Shibuya for 2 years after graduation." Kenji felt something shift inside him, like a door opening after being locked for hours. Here was someone who not only spoke his language but understood the culture behind it, the way she held herself, the respectful distance she maintained while still engaging in conversation, the proper use of honorific language. It all felt familiar and comfortable in a way that nothing else had all evening. "Waseda University," he said, impressed. "That's a very prestigious program. What brought you back to New York?" "Family circumstances," she replied simply, refilling his glass with practiced precision. "My mother became ill, and I needed to be here to help care for her. I'm Maya, by the way. I'm Kenji Nakamura. It's truly a pleasure to meet you, Maya." She nodded respectfully. "I know who you are, Mr. Nakamura. Your company's work in predictive AI has been featured in several Japanese business publications I follow. Very impressive innovations." Kenji felt his eyebrows raise. Not only did this woman speak his language and understand his culture, but she was also familiar with his work. It was more recognition and understanding than he'd received from anyone else at this dinner, despite their wealth and supposed business sophistication. "You still follow Japanese business news?" he asked. "Of course," Maya said, moving to serve the guest next to him while continuing their conversation in low tones. "Japan remains one of the most innovative markets in the world for technology. I try to stay current with developments there, especially in AI and robotics." As Maya moved around the table, efficiently serving other guests, Kenji found himself watching her with new interest. The other diners barely seemed to notice her presence, treating her as part of the background. But her earlier comments suggested she understood more about international business than most of the people sitting at this table. When she returned to his side of the table a few minutes later, he decided to continue their conversation. "I have to ask," he said quietly in Japanese. "What do you think of American business culture compared to what you experienced in Tokyo?" Maya paused in her work, considering the question carefully. "It's very different," she said finally. "Americans tend to be more direct and fast-paced, which can be efficient, But sometimes I think they miss the value of patience and careful relationship building that I learned to appreciate in Japan. Her answer was thoughtful and nuanced, exactly the kind of cultural insight Kenji had been hoping to gain from this dinner. Here was someone who had lived and worked in both cultures, who could bridge the gap he'd been struggling with all evening. "Are you enjoying this evening's dinner?" Maya asked, and something in her tone suggested she had noticed his earlier struggles with the conversation. Kenji hesitated, then decided to be honest. "It's been challenging," he admitted. "Everyone is very successful and intelligent, but I find myself feeling somewhat lost in the style of conversation. Everything moves so quickly here." Maya nodded, understandingly. American business dinners can be overwhelming at first. The communication style is very different from what you're used to. In Japan, there's more space for reflection, more respect for silence and careful thought. "Exactly," Kenji said, feeling relieved that someone finally understood. "I have things I could contribute to these conversations, but by the time I've considered my words carefully, the topic has moved on to something else entirely." "That's very common for Japanese executives in American social settings," Maya said as she adjusted some glasses on the table. "The cultural expectations around conversation timing are completely different. In Japan, interrupting someone is considered very rude, but here it's often seen as engagement and enthusiasm." Their conversation was interrupted when Patricia, the hostess, called for everyone's attention to introduce a special guest who had just arrived. But as the table's focus shifted to the new arrival, Kenji found himself thinking about what Maya had said. She had articulated something he'd been feeling but couldn't quite put into words. When the commotion died down and conversation resumed around the table, Maya appeared at his side again, this time offering a selection of desserts. "The chocolate torte is excellent," she said in Japanese, "but if you prefer something lighter, I'd recommend the fruit tart." "What would you suggest for someone who's had a long evening of trying to navigate cultural differences?" Kenji asked. With a slight smile, Maya smiled back. "Definitely the chocolate. Comfort food transcends all cultures." As she served his dessert, she leaned slightly closer. "If I may say so, Mr. Nakamura, I don't think the problem is with you. You have valuable perspectives that these people could benefit from hearing. It's just a matter of finding the right moment and the right approach." "What do you mean?" Kenji asked, intrigued. "Well," Maya said, glancing around the table to make sure no one was listening, "Americans respect confidence and direct communication. If you wait for the perfect pause in conversation, you'll be waiting all night. Sometimes you have to create your own opening." She moved away to serve other guests, but her words stayed with Kenji. He realized that Maya had given him more useful advice about navigating American business culture in 5 minutes than he'd gotten from months of research and preparation. When she returned to clear his dessert plate, he had another question ready. "You mentioned working for a consulting firm in Tokyo. What kind of work did you do there?" "International market entry strategy," Maya replied. "I helped American and European companies understand how to adapt their business models for Japanese consumers. Cultural translation, you might say." Kenji felt a spark of excitement. "That's exactly what I need, but in reverse. I'm trying to understand how to bring my company's approach to American markets without losing what makes us unique." Maya's eyes lit up with interest. "That's a fascinating challenge. Japanese business philosophy has a lot to offer American markets, especially in terms of long-term thinking and relationship building. But you're right that direct translation doesn't work." Their conversation was becoming more animated, and Kenji realized he was having the most engaging discussion of the entire evening. Maya understood not just his language and culture, but the specific business challenges he was facing. She had insights from both sides of the cultural divide, and her perspective was illuminating in ways that surprised him. For the first time, all evening, Kenji felt like he was talking to someone who truly grasped both who he was and what he was trying to accomplish. It was ironic that this understanding was coming from someone the other guests had barely acknowledged, someone they probably assumed had nothing valuable to contribute to their high-level business discussions. As Maya moved away to help with the next course, Kenji found himself hoping their conversation would continue. In a room full of successful people who should have been natural allies, He had finally found someone who spoke his language in every sense that mattered. As the evening progressed into coffee and after-dinner drinks, the formal dinner setting began to relax. Guests moved from the dining room back to the living room, forming smaller conversation groups. Some stepped out onto the balcony to enjoy the city view, while others settled into the comfortable seating areas scattered throughout the apartment. Kenji found himself near the windows overlooking Central Park, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the city lights twinkle below. The conversations around him continued in their rapid-fire style, touching on everything from upcoming elections to vacation plans in the French Riviera. He participated when directly addressed, but mostly he found himself thinking about his earlier conversation with Maya. As if summoned by his thoughts, Maya appeared beside him with a fresh pot of coffee. "Would you care for a refill, Mr. Nakamura?" she asked in Japanese, her voice low enough that nearby guests wouldn't overhear. "Please," he replied, extending his cup. "And Maya, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about creating your own opening in conversations. How exactly does one do that in a setting like this?" Maya glanced around the room, making sure her supervisor wasn't watching, then stepped slightly closer. "Well, Americans appreciate directness, but they also respond well to questions that demonstrate expertise. Instead of waiting to add to someone else's point, try asking a question that naturally leads to your area of knowledge." She paused to serve coffee to another guest, then returned to continue their conversation. "For example," she said quietly, "earlier when they were discussing market volatility, you could have asked something like, 'I'm curious how American investors view long-term stability versus quick returns, because in Japan we've found that patience often yields better results.' That would have created space for you to share your perspective." Kenji nodded, impressed by her insight. "That's very clever. You understand both the communication style and the business content." "Working in consulting taught me that every culture has its own language of business," Maya said. "The key is learning to translate not just words but concepts and approaches." Their conversation was interrupted when David, the tech entrepreneur, approached with his phone in hand. "Kenji, I've been trying to reach my development team in Seoul, but I'm having trouble understanding some of the cultural nuances in our partnership negotiations. You wouldn't happen to have any insights about working with Korean businesses, would you?" This was exactly the kind of opportunity Maya had been describing. Kenji took a breath and decided to try her approach. "That's interesting, David. Korean business culture shares some similarities with Japanese culture, but there are important differences. What specific challenges are you encountering?" As David explained his situation, Kenji found himself naturally drawn into a substantive conversation about Asian business practices, relationship building, and the importance of understanding hierarchical structures in Korean companies. Other guests began to gather around, genuinely interested in his insights. Maya moved discreetly around the group, refilling drinks and clearing glasses, but Kenji could see her listening with approval as he successfully navigated the conversation, in a way he hadn't managed all evening. When the group discussion eventually broke up, Maya appeared at his side again. "That was excellent," she said in Japanese. "You see? You have valuable knowledge. It's just a matter of finding the right entry point." "Thank you for the advice," Kenji replied. "But I have to say, your own insights about business culture are quite sophisticated. Consulting work must have been very fulfilling." A shadow crossed Maya's face. "It was. I loved helping companies bridge cultural gaps, finding ways to make international partnerships successful. But life doesn't always go according to plan." Kenji sensed there was more to her story. "You mentioned family circumstances brought you back to New York. That must have been a difficult decision." Maya was quiet for a moment, organizing some empty glasses on her tray. "My mother developed early onset Alzheimer's. My father passed away when I was in college, so I'm her only family. The consulting firm was understanding, but working in Tokyo while trying to coordinate her care from across the ocean became impossible." "I'm sorry," Kenji said sincerely. "That must be incredibly challenging." "It is," Maya admitted. "But she's my mother. Some things are more important than career advancement, you know? Though I have to admit, some days I miss the intellectual stimulation of that work." Kenji felt a surge of respect for this young woman. She had given up a promising career in a field she was clearly passionate about to care for her family. It spoke to values he understood deeply, the kind of loyalty and sacrifice that were highly respected in Japanese culture. "What do you miss most about the consulting work?" he asked. Maya's eyes lit up as she considered the question. "I love the puzzle aspect of it. Every company, every market entry challenge was different. You had to understand not just the business model and the target market, but all the cultural undercurrents that could make or break a venture." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then continued with growing enthusiasm. "For example, I once worked with an American clothing retailer who wanted to expand into Japan. They had done all the market research, understood the demographics and spending patterns, but they completely missed the cultural significance of seasonal colors and the importance of limited edition items in creating desire among Japanese consumers." Kenji found himself leaning forward, fascinated by her perspective. "What did you recommend?" "We restructured their entire launch strategy around the concept of exclusive, seasonal collections, rather than their usual approach of maintaining consistent inventory year-round. We also adapted their marketing to emphasize craftsmanship and attention to detail, rather than price and convenience. The launch was incredibly successful." "That's brilliant," Kenji said. "You understand something that many consultants miss, that successful international expansion isn't about transplanting your business model unchanged. It's about adapting your core strengths to resonate with local values." "Exactly," Maya said, her professional passion clearly shining through. "And the reverse is true too. When Japanese companies want to expand into American markets, they often struggle because they're trying too hard to become completely American, when what they should be doing is finding ways to make their Japanese strengths appealing to American consumers." This was precisely the challenge Kenji was facing with his own company's expansion. "What would you suggest for a Japanese AI company that wants to enter the American market?" Maya set down her tray and gave the question serious consideration. "Well, Japanese companies often have advantages in long-term thinking, quality control, and systematic problem-solving that Americans actually value highly, especially in technology. But Japanese marketing tends to be very humble and indirect, which doesn't work well in America." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "I think the key would be to maintain your systematic, quality-focused approach to AI development, but learn to communicate your innovations with more confidence and directness. Americans want to understand not just what your technology does, but why it's better than what they're already using." Kenji was amazed by the clarity of her analysis. In just a few minutes, Maya had identified core challenges that had been troubling him for months and offered concrete suggestions for addressing them. "You have a remarkable understanding of these cross-cultural business dynamics," he said. "Have you considered returning to consulting? I imagine there are firms here in New York that would value your expertise." Maya sighed. "I've thought about it, but my mother's condition is unpredictable. Some days are good, some are very difficult. I need work that offers flexibility, and high-level consulting usually demands complete availability." Kenji nodded thoughtfully. "What if there were a way to use your skills that allowed for that flexibility?" Before Maya could respond, her supervisor approached, clearly indicating that it was time for her to return to her duties. But as she moved away, Kenji found himself thinking about their conversation with growing excitement. Here was someone who understood both his cultural background and his business challenges better than anyone else he'd met in months of trying to build American connections. More than that, she had insights and experience that could be genuinely valuable to his company's expansion plans. As the evening began to wind down and guests started making their farewells, Kenji realized that the most valuable conversation of the night hadn't come from any of the wealthy, powerful people he'd expected to learn from. It had come from someone everyone else in the room had overlooked completely, someone whose potential they couldn't even see. The evening was winding down, and guests were beginning to gather their coats and exchange final business cards. Kenji stood near the entrance, shaking hands and making polite promises to continue the conversation soon, with people he wasn't sure he'd ever truly connected with. The familiar weight of cultural isolation was settling back onto his shoulders, as he prepared to return to his hotel. But his mind kept returning to his conversations with Maya throughout the evening. Her insights about American business culture, her sophisticated understanding of international market entry strategies, her ability to bridge the gap between Japanese and American approaches. It had been the most valuable part of his entire New York trip. As he was about to leave, Kenji made a decision that surprised even himself. "Patricia," he said to the hostess, who was bidding farewell to other guests, "before I go, I wonder if I might say something to the group." Patricia looked momentarily confused, but quickly recovered with her practiced hostess smile. "Of course, Kenji, I'm sure everyone would love to hear from you." She called for attention and the remaining guests turned toward them expectantly. Kenji found himself standing in front of about 15 people, all looking at him with polite curiosity. His heart was beating faster than usual, but he knew he had to do this. "I want to thank you all for a wonderful evening," he began, his English carefully measured but clear. "When I came here tonight, I was hoping to learn about American business culture and to understand how to bridge the gap between Eastern and Western approaches to innovation." The guests nodded politely, probably expecting a standard thank you speech. "I have to admit," Kenji continued, "I struggled at first this evening. The pace of conversation, the cultural references, the communication style, it was all quite different from what I'm accustomed to. I found myself feeling somewhat lost despite being surrounded by such accomplished people." A few guests exchanged glances, unsure where this was heading. But then I had a series of conversations that completely changed my perspective on the evening, and honestly on my entire approach to expanding my business into American markets. Kenji paused, looking around the room until he spotted Maya, who was quietly collecting the last of the coffee cups near the kitchen entrance. She had frozen when she realized he was talking about their conversations. "These insights came from Maya," Kenji said, gesturing toward her, "the young woman who has been serving us so professionally all evening." All heads turned toward Maya, who looked absolutely stunned. Some guests appeared confused, as if they were trying to remember who she was. "Maya studied international business at Waseda University in Tokyo," Kenji continued, "one of Japan's most prestigious programs. She worked for a consulting firm in Tokyo, specializing in helping companies navigate cross-cultural business challenges. Her understanding of both Japanese and American business cultures is exceptional." Maya's supervisor, who had been about to escort her to the kitchen, stopped in her tracks. The guests were now looking at Maya with new interest, some with expressions of surprise. "Throughout this evening, Maya has provided me with insights about American business communication, cultural adaptation strategies, and market entry approaches that are more sophisticated and practical than anything I've heard from expensive consulting firms I've hired in the past." David, the tech entrepreneur, was staring at Maya with obvious recognition dawning on his face. "Wait, you're the one who understood the Korean business cultural issues I was asking about earlier, aren't you? I saw you listening and you looked like you knew exactly what I was talking about." Maya nodded slowly, still appearing overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "She has a remarkable ability to understand the nuances of cross-cultural business relationships," Kenji said. "More importantly, she can translate between different business philosophies in ways that preserve the strengths of each culture while adapting for new markets." Robert, the investment firm owner, stepped forward. "Are you saying she has professional experience in international business consulting?" 2 years with a top-tier firm in Tokyo, Kenji confirmed, helping American and European companies successfully enter Japanese markets. Catherine, who ran the sustainable energy company, looked embarrassed. "I have to admit, I didn't even notice. I mean, we never really," "which is exactly my point," Kenji said gently. "Tonight I learned something important about assumptions and overlooked opportunities. While I was struggling to connect with people who seemed similar to me on the surface, the person who truly understood my challenges and could offer genuine solutions was someone I almost didn't get to know at all." He turned directly to Maya, who was still holding her tray of coffee cups looking like she wanted to disappear. "Maya, I have a proposition for you," Kenji said. "My company is expanding into the American market, and we desperately need someone who understands both cultures, someone who can help us maintain our Japanese strengths while adapting to American expectations. Would you consider working with us as a cultural liaison and market entry consultant? The room went completely silent. Maya's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I know you have family responsibilities, Kenji continued, so this would be structured to provide the flexibility you need. Initially, it could be project-based consulting work that you could do from New York. If things go well, we could discuss expanding the role or even opening a small American office here. Patricia was staring at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. You studied at Waseda University? That's incredibly impressive. I had no idea, said Victoria, the hotel owner. Your English is so perfect, I just assumed. Maya finally found her voice. Mr. Nakamura, this is very unexpected. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it, Kenji replied. What I'm offering is a chance to return to the work you're passionate about, but with the flexibility to care for your mother. My company values loyalty and family commitment. Those aren't obstacles to success, they're indicators of character. David stepped forward. Actually, if you don't mind me asking, Maya, would you be interested in freelance consulting work? Because after hearing this, I think I could really use your perspective on my Korean partnership challenges. And we're always looking for cultural consultants for our international hotel projects, Victoria added, looking somewhat ashamed of her earlier assumptions. Maya looked around the room at all these successful people who were suddenly seeing her as a peer rather than invisible service staff. Her eyes were bright with what looked like unshed tears. This is very generous, she said quietly. All of you. But Mr. Nakamura, I have to ask, why? You could hire established consulting firms, people with more experience and better credentials. Kenji smiled. Because tonight you taught me something that no expensive consultant has been able to teach me in months of trying. You showed me that understanding comes not from shared backgrounds or similar experiences, but from the ability to truly listen and to see beyond surface assumptions. He paused, looking around the room at the other guests who were now paying attention in a way they hadn't all evening. You all are successful people with valuable insights and experiences, but tonight I learned the most from someone I almost missed entirely, someone whose potential was invisible to me until I took the time to really listen. That's a lesson worth remembering in business and in life. Maya set down her tray with shaking hands. Mr. Nakamura, if you're serious about this opportunity, then yes, I would very much like to discuss working with your company. The room erupted in conversation as guests began approaching Maya with genuine interest, asking about her background and experience. Patricia was apologizing for not knowing about her educational background, while David was already discussing potential consulting projects. As Kenji watched the transformation, Maya going from invisible service worker to recognized professional in a matter of minutes, he realized that this evening had taught him something profound about the nature of opportunity and recognition. The most valuable connections weren't always the obvious ones, and the most important insights often came from the most unexpected sources. Later, as he finally prepared to leave, Maya approached him privately. Thank you, she said simply. Not just for the job opportunity, but for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for reminding me that wisdom and talent come in many forms, Kenji replied, and that sometimes the person who can help you the most is the one you least expect. As his car pulled away from the elegant brownstone, Kenji reflected on the evening's events. He had come to this dinner hoping to build relationships with powerful American business leaders. Instead, he had discovered something far more valuable, that true understanding and meaningful connections could come from anywhere, and that the key to success wasn't just about networking with the right people, but about being open to recognizing value wherever it might be found. The dinner party that had begun with him feeling isolated and disconnected had ended with a genuine partnership and a lesson he would never forget. Sometimes the most important voice in the room was the one that almost went unheard.